A high-stakes gamble. That's when the United States made a move it believed would finally crush Venezuela's oil industry. Not weaken it, not pressure it, end it. Inside policy circles, this wasn't just another round of sanctions. It was something far more extreme, what economists quietly describe as a financial nuclear option. Washington was acting with total confidence. The logic was simple. The United States sits at the center of the global economy. Access to American consumers, American dollars, and American markets is the lifeblood of international trade. If the United States decided to cut someone off, that country would have nowhere left to go. At least that's how this strategy had worked for decades. So when the United States targeted Venezuela, the expectation was clear. Cut off its oil revenue, the country's main source of income, and the system would collapse under its own weight. No oil money meant no government stability, no leverage, no choice but to give in. But here's the twist. This move didn't break Venezuela. It didn't isolate the country the way Washington expected. Instead, it reshaped who really holds power in the global economy. What was meant to be a decisive show of American strength ended up exposing something far more dangerous. The limits of that strength in a world that no longer revolves around a single superpower. This story isn't just about oil, or sanctions, or Venezuela. It's about how a weapon that once guaranteed control suddenly stopped working, and how one miscalculation helped shift the balance of global power in ways the United States never intended. So the question isn't what the United States did. The real question is, how did something this powerful fail? To understand why this strategy should have worked, you first have to understand how carefully it was designed. The opening move came quietly but carried enormous weight. In early 2025, the United States revoked Chevron's operating license in Venezuela. That single decision shut down the last major American-run oil operation in the country. Over 100,000 barrels of oil per day, gone almost overnight. This alone sent a clear message: the United States was done playing around. But that wasn't the main weapon. The real shock came weeks later when Washington unveiled something the global economy had almost never seen before: secondary tariffs on a massive scale. Here's how it worked. The United States didn't just tell American companies to stop buying Venezuelan oil. Instead, it told every country on Earth, if you buy even 1 barrel of Venezuelan oil, we will slap a 25% tariff on all of your exports to the United States. Not just oil, everything. Phones, cars, clothing, furniture, electronics. To understand how extreme that is, consider this. The average United States tariff historically sits around 2%. A 25% tariff isn't a nudge, it's a wall. Overnight, a country's products would become too expensive to sell in the United States market. Factories would lose customers. Jobs would vanish. Governments would feel the pressure immediately. This is why many economists called it economic blackmail. The choice was brutal and simple. Trade with the United States or trade with Venezuela. You don't get both. And the math behind the plan looked flawless. Venezuela exports oil because it has buyers. Remove the buyers, and the exports drop to zero. Scare off Europe, scare off India, scare off smaller economies that rely on United States access to survive. One by one, every door closes. On paper, this wasn't just pressure, it was a chokehold. A strategy designed not to wound, but to suffocate. At the heart of the U.S. strategy was a belief that had guided American policy for decades, and for a long time, it really worked. The assumption was simple: no country would ever risk losing access to the U.S. economy. The United States isn't just another market. It's a roughly $20 trillion economy, the largest pool of consumers on Earth. For most countries, selling goods to the U.S. keeps factories running, workers employed, and governments stable. Losing that access isn't inconvenient, it's devastating. So U.S. policymakers believed the choice they were forcing on the world was no choice at all. Venezuela, by contrast, was struggling. Its economy was fragile. Its oil industry was already under strain, cut off its buyers, and the government would run out of money fast. No revenue meant no fuel, no imports, no stability. Eventually, Caracas would be forced to bend. From Washington's perspective, this wasn't reckless. It was logical. It was how sanctions had worked before. But here's the problem. That logic only works in a unipolar world. A world where the United States is the single economic gravity center and every other country orbits around it. A world where being locked out of the U.S. market is a death sentence. That world no longer exists. The global economy has changed, but U.S. strategy hadn't fully caught up. Over the last 2 decades, alternative systems quietly grew alongside the American one: new trade routes, new financial institutions, new supply chains, and new political alliances that don't depend on Washington's approval. And that's where the fatal mistake lies. The U.S. assumed every country would panic when faced with a 25% tariff threat. But they failed to account for one player that didn't need to panic at all. One country that didn't have to choose between Venezuela and the United States, because it was already in conflict with Washington. That country was China, and once China entered the picture, the entire logic of the sanctions collapsed. China looked at the U.S. sanctions and, honestly, saw something very different from what Washington saw. By 2025, China and the United States were already deep into a trade war. Chinese exports to the U.S. had been facing tariffs for years. Supply chains had adjusted. Companies had rerouted production. The economic shock had already been absorbed. So when the U.S. threatened a new 25% tariff, it didn't feel like a knockout punch to Beijing. It felt more like an extra weight added to a barbell China was already lifting. In other words, the threat didn't change China's reality the way it changed everyone else's. But the real opportunity came from what the sanctions did to everyone else. European countries backed away. India stepped back. Smaller economies didn't even hesitate. One by one, buyers disappeared, not because Venezuela ran out of oil, but because buying it had become too risky. Economists have a word for this: a monopsony, a market where there's only one major buyer. And when there's only one buyer, that buyer sets the terms. China wasn't reacting emotionally or trying to score a political point. It was doing what it does best: negotiating from a position of overwhelming leverage. With the competitive field cleared by U.S. sanctions, China could demand discounts, long-term contracts, and strategic concessions, cheap oil, reliable supply, decades of energy security. What Washington thought would create scarcity actually created control, but not American control. The sanctions didn't trap Venezuela in isolation. They funneled it into a single economic lane, and China was waiting at the end of it. This is the moment the story flips completely. The sanctions stopped being a punishment for China. They became a gift, a chance to lock down a strategic energy source while everyone else was forced to step aside. And China didn't just take advantage quietly, it made a statement. China's next move made one thing unmistakably clear. This wasn't a temporary deal or a quiet workaround. In September 2025, while much of the world was still focused on the fallout from U.S. tariffs, a Chinese company moved forward with a massive project inside Venezuela. In Lake Maracaibo, the heart of the country's oil industry, China began installing the first major new offshore oil platform Venezuela had seen in years. This wasn't a symbolic investment. It was a billion-dollar commitment. The goal was bold. Production at the site was expected to rise from about 12,000 barrels per day to nearly 60,000 barrels per day by 2026. That's a 5-fold increase. And projects like this don't pay off in months. They pay off over decades. Think about the contrast. At the exact moment the United States was trying to shut Venezuela's oil industry down, cutting off buyers, revoking licenses, and applying pressure, China was doing the opposite. It was physically rebuilding Venezuela's energy infrastructure, drilling, installing platforms, training workers, locking in future supply. This wasn't opportunistic trading. It wasn't a short-term discount hunt. Infrastructure is commitment. You don't spend billions on steel, drilling rigs, and offshore platforms unless you plan to be there for the long haul. This was China saying very clearly, we're not passing through, we're staying. And that message mattered, because once infrastructure is built, it changes the future. Oil fields, pipelines, and platforms tie countries together in ways sanctions can't easily undo. The relationship becomes physical, not just financial. By this point, it should have been obvious. The shift underway wasn't reversible. Venezuela wasn't waiting out U.S. pressure. It was restructuring its entire oil industry around a new anchor. But this partnership didn't appear overnight. It was built on something deeper, older, and far harder to break than any trade deal: debt. To understand why U.S. sanctions barely slowed the flow of oil to China, you have to look beneath the surface, past headlines and trade data, and into the financial structure binding these two countries together. Over the years, China has loaned Venezuela an estimated $60 billion. But this wasn't a normal loan. Venezuela didn't agree to pay that money back with cash. It agreed to pay it back with oil. Think of it like running a tab that can only be settled with one specific currency. In this case, that currency is barrels of crude. Every shipment of oil sent to China isn't a market transaction. It's a debt payment. That distinction changes everything. These shipments aren't optional. They aren't based on price signals or political moods. They're legally binding obligations. Venezuela is required to send oil, and China is entitled to receive it. No sanction can scare off a creditor collecting what it's already owed. This creates a closed loop. Venezuela must export oil to survive financially, and China must accept that oil to recover its loans. U.S. sanctions don't break the loop. They sit outside of it, and this financial bond is reinforced by something even stronger: politics. In 2023, Venezuela became the first country in Latin America to enter what China calls an all-weather strategic partnership. This is Beijing's highest level of diplomatic commitment, reserved for countries it considers strategically essential. All-weather means exactly what it sounds like. Good times or bad, calm or crisis, China stays. So when the U.S. escalated pressure in 2025, Beijing wasn't improvising. It had already decided, years earlier, that Venezuela was worth defending economically and politically, even if that meant absorbing friction with Washington. This reframes the entire situation. The United States wasn't pressuring a weak, isolated government. It was challenging a fortified alliance built on debt, infrastructure, and long-term strategic planning. And while Washington was focused on breaking Venezuela, it missed something else entirely. The sanctions weren't just failing abroad. They were creating problems at home. While the sanctions were reshaping Venezuela's future, they were also quietly creating a mess inside the United States. Along the U.S. Gulf Coast, places like Texas and Louisiana sit some of the most expensive and complex oil refineries in the world. These facilities weren't built to process just any oil. Over decades, they were engineered to handle heavy, crude, thick, dense oil that's harder to refine but often cheaper to buy. And for years, Venezuela was one of the best suppliers of exactly that kind of oil. When Venezuelan crude suddenly disappeared from the U.S. market, these refineries couldn't simply flip a switch and replace it. It's like building an engine designed for diesel and then being told it must now run on gasoline. Technically possible, but slow, costly, and inefficient. Refineries scrambled to find alternatives. Heavy crude had to be sourced from Canada or the Middle East, often at higher prices and with longer transport routes. In some cases, facilities had to undergo expensive modifications just to handle different oil blends. All of this raised costs. Higher costs for refineries mean thinner profit margins. Thin margins mean delayed investments, higher fuel prices, and pressure passed down the line to consumers. The sanctions didn't just hurt Venezuela, they imposed a multi-billion-dollar adjustment bill on American companies. This is where the strategy starts to look deeply flawed. The U.S. had aimed to weaponize its economic dominance. Instead, it exposed a dependency it had built into its own energy system. By cutting off a key supplier without a smooth replacement, Washington created new vulnerabilities for the very industries it was supposed to protect. At this point, the question was no longer whether the sanctions were working. The real question became, who were they actually helping? Because by late 2025, the data made the answer impossible to ignore. By October 2025, the results were in, and they told a story very different from the one Washington had planned. Yes, U.S. sanctions did reduce Venezuela's overall oil exports. They fell by about 26%. On paper, that looks like success. But when you look closer, the real outcome becomes clear. Venezuela's oil didn't disappear. It moved. Roughly 80% of all Venezuelan oil exports, about 663,000 barrels per day, were now flowing to China. China had become not just the biggest customer, but the dominant one. Meanwhile, the United States, once a major buyer, was receiving a fraction of that amount. This wasn't diversification. This was near total dependence. What the U.S. strategy was meant to do, collapse Venezuela through isolation, never happened. Instead, it handed China effective control over one of the world's largest proven oil reserves, at discounted prices under long-term agreements, backed by debt and infrastructure. Then came the final lock. In November 2025, China and Venezuela announced a zero-tariff trade agreement covering hundreds of products, from agriculture to manufactured goods. This pushed the relationship far beyond oil. Venezuela wasn't just selling energy anymore, it was being woven directly into China's global supply chain. At this point, the meaning of the story becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a failed sanctions campaign. It was a stress test for American power, and it revealed a new reality. Economic coercion no longer guarantees control. In a multipolar world, pressure applied in one direction can create opportunity in another. The United States used its strongest tool and discovered its limits. China didn't have to confront Washington directly. It simply waited, adapted, and absorbed the outcome. That's the real lesson here. The most dangerous outcome in modern geopolitics isn't outright failure. It's when your actions succeed in empowering your strongest rival. We've entered an era where every move has second and third-order consequences. Power is no longer centralized. It's distributed across competing economic systems. And that means the rules of the game have changed. If you want to understand what future sanctions, trade wars, and geopolitical pressure campaigns will really look like, this is the blueprint. So the question going forward is simple. In a multipolar world, does economic warfare still work, or does it just change who wins? If this helped you see global power differently, consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts below.